to get some pizza and a drink, and thank you all for braving the weather today to join us to talk about Kratom. The title of our panel, in some sense, captures what we're going to be doing today. What is it, and how should it be regulated? Getting educated on this topic, its relationship to some broader drug policy issues is very exciting for me to have had the opportunity to put the panel together. Thank Yana Herdnova, the Administrative Director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center. I'm Doug Berman, the Director of the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center, and again, grateful that you could make it today despite the weather, so we can have a discussion that will include some time at the end for Q&A about Kratom and what is it. As you see from our slide, we've got three terrific panelists to talk with us. Unfortunately, because of the weather, Dr. Robert Weber over at the pharmacy school has to come in remotely. We'll get him up on the screen in a minute for his overview and introduction. Then we have Jeff Laird, Law School. We see something that's discussed in some other drug policy arrangements as well, marijuana being the one that comes to mind. Interesting diversity across the states right now in terms of the way in which they're treating this drug under their existing laws. And Mac's going to wind up our introductions with a PowerPoint slide discussing that a little bit more fully. But again, the part of this story that is why we wanted to have this very first panel to talk about this issue, understanding the drug, understanding how regulators and policymakers are responding to this drug. And for me, one of the questions that I'll be asking the panelists is, why now? Kratom, as you may know or may not know, has been a plant for a very long time, longer than any of us have been around. And so why right now this issue is becoming pertinent, both right here in the state of Ohio and nationwide, is among the topics that we'll be talking about. And so with that very basic background and not wanting to take up more time from our participants, I want to now shift to, and let's see if I can do the technology right, having Dr. Weber. There you are. Now we've got you on the big screen, so thank you for making yourself available despite needing to be across campus at this time. Can you hear us?
Oh yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great, and so maybe just speak up a little bit, but I think everyone in the audience is nodding that they can hear you, and so, as I mentioned, grateful for you to introduce yourself and your thoughts on this basic topic.
Sure. Okay, my name is Bob Weber. I'm the Administrator Chief Pharmacy Officer at the Medical Center. I'm joined here by my two residents, Emily and Broderick. I don't know if you can see them or not.
We can. Hello.
But, my experience, I have around 40 years of experience as a pharmacist. My training is primarily in hospital pharmacy, so I'm a hospital pharmacist. By training, I'm a clinical pharmacist who worked in the critical care area as well as in general internal medicine for around 20 years or so, worked in general internal medicine, and actually have a lot of experience with herbal preparations, which I consider this to be somewhat of an herbal supplement. So I have a lot of experience with patients who have used herbal supplements. I also, for many years at the University of Pittsburgh, I was administratively responsible for the Pittsburgh Poison Center. So I have a close connection with the American Society of Poison Control Center. And I know that organization very well. I know the data that they publish around various products, various exposures for patients. So I have a lot of experience around patient use of herbal preparations, also just a lot of experience just around regulatory aspects of medication use. So when I look at this agent, I consider, first of all, I can't, as a state employee and as a instrumentality of the state, I really can't endorse this product. I can't endorse it in any way. I can just provide information, what I know in my opinion in terms of herbal supplements in general. I can tell you that herbal supplements, and for those in the room that don't understand about how herbal supplements work, herbal supplements are generally a very low dosage of a active ingredient, whether it be something like St. John's wort or something like that. And generally, the effect of an herbal supplement does not occur immediately. So when patients take herbal supplements, often it takes several weeks for an herbal supplement to be effective. But one of the sort of my view on this product is that it is a new receptor agonist. So it is an opioid acting drug. It has many of the characteristics of opiates in terms of side effects, in terms of its actual effect. And so, again, probably the biggest question I have when I see any herbal supplement, including this drug, is what is the right dose? I don't think we know that. For something like St. John wort, which has a low dose of an antidepressant, the dose is not as critical. It is something that people take for several weeks, and all of a sudden they may feel like they're getting less depressed, they may feel better. With a drug like with a substance like kratom, I think folks may expect to see the effect right away. That's not necessarily going to happen unless I don't understand the product. Plus, the dose isn't regulated, the product's not regulated. There's been many of the herbal supplements, there's been issues with the herbal supplement being tainted by other medications. So, for example, there have been cases of St. John wort being tainted with SSRIs, or really, I would say, prescription medications. So there's the danger that somebody could be selling kratom as a product and ship a bunch of leaves, which is really, laced with opioids. So we've got the regulatory issue around just the consistency of the product, the proper dose, and really what is the right dose. And then obviously the opioid crisis sort of leads into this in terms of using an opiate-like drug at a time when we have a severe crisis in this country around opiate use in general. So I just think there needs to be a lot of work done in determining what is the dose. There needs to be work done in determining the consistency and integrity of the product. I think that obviously that work is ongoing. That work needs to be done, and at this time, I think the jury is still out on this.
Effective table setting comments. I'll then shift it now over to Jeff, so you can talk about your background and history working on these sets of topics, and then focus in on this drug, and then I think Mac's going to give us a little presentation on his take on where we are and speak to some of the issues that you talked about, Dr. Weber.
Well, thanks. My name is Jeff Laredo. Up until August, I worked directly for all of you. I'm a 30-year former federal employee. I worked most of my career at the National Institutes of Health, and for the last 17 years was at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. I also worked at the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is a services agency within HHS. I am a stereotype of the federal policy geek. This is what we look like. Maybe a little bit better dressed today than I usually was, but take my word for it, this is what we look like. I'm a policy guy. I am not a scientist. I'm a science policy expert, but I'm not a scientist. And for the past few years, one of the topics that I worked on while at NIDA were the policy issues around kratom. I find myself agreeing with Dr. Weber on a lot of things. There's a lot more that we need to know, and that's part of what we're here to talk about today. And I won't, Mac, I won't step on some of your issues with that. I know a lot more than the average public health person about drug policy, both legal and illegal drug policy, and can certainly talk about things. We're here today to talk about kratom, but if you want to broaden that discussion at some point, I'm very happy to do that as well. You mentioned the marijuana policy issue as something that conflates or confuses this kind of discussion. You're absolutely right. Dr. Weber, you mentioned the opioid crisis. That also contextually is an enormous deal, especially in states like Ohio. And there's both good and bad to that when you're having policy discussions around what to do with a product like kratom. So let me leave that there.
Although I'm going to ask one follow-up question right away as you sort of piggyback off that, and maybe to set the table a little bit for even in Mac's presentation. from your work historically in the federal system and the kind of dual and maybe challengingly competing regulatory structures that the federal government creates and the state governments create, is it at times a positive when states are all over the map, the so-called laboratories of democracy that allows us to perhaps experiment with different regulatory frameworks for drug policy, especially new drugs or uncertain drugs, or is it more trouble and a dangerous experiment when you don't have the federal government providing kind of a leading role and a leading voice in this space? Both based on your history and maybe your current perspective, who should lead on topics like this, given that there's so much more we need to know and how much uncertainty there can be as policy views are evolving?
Well, that's actually a somewhat difficult, it's a more complicated question than you might think. My personal opinion, because I'm an institutionalist and I'm somewhat of a big government liberal personally, I'd like to see the federal government provide overall blanket leadership on things because the federal system is broad and deep and if active, can provide a lot of leadership. That said, certainly in the drug policy world, the feds have provided some leadership and have provided some unbelievable roadblocks. And so when we get into a discussion about Schedule 1, for example, that's been a nightmare, especially within the research community, because while it doesn't absolutely prevent research from being done, it makes it very, very difficult and much more difficult than for Schedules 2 through 5. And so there are and continue to be blood on the walls argument between and among the HHS agencies and especially the DEA and about how to do, what to do, how to move forward. And Dr. Weber said, there's so much more we need to know. That's exactly right. And so people like me would argue all the time, well, if there's so much more that we need to know, why would you be taking steps to do things specifically to make it harder for research scientists to figure that stuff out?
Very good, thank you, very helpful. And so back now I'm going to try to pull up your slide deck.
Okay, while Doug is doing that, thank you to obviously all of you for braving this weather. Thank you to the Center for hosting this forum. We think it's critically important, particularly here in Ohio, where the Board of Pharmacy staff has made recommendations, and the Board of Pharmacy is considering banning kratom in the state of Ohio completely. So, you want me to wait for a second?
Yeah, can we just wait for one second? There's a mic problem for you.
We're videotaping this so that your colleagues can watch it, and you can also work with, show it to folks outside of Ohio, because this is a national issue.
All right, I think I have your deck up.
I think you hit the bottom button there.
So on the bottom.
That one?
No.
Oh, this. All right, good. I'm good, that's fine.
Okay.
So while they're messing with that, I'll also tell you quickly, I started in politics as a young man. I ran Warren Hatch's campaign for the U.S. Senate in Utah, and that tells you how old I am, although I was very young when I did that.
Right?
That's right. And I went to work in the Reagan administration, was the Chief of Staff, Department of Health and Human Services. And so I got to know a lot about FDA regulation, and I was heavily involved in the dietary supplement battle that took place in the early 90s that resulted in the enactment of the DSHEA Act, which is the Dietary Safety, Health, and Education Act, which dealt with a pathway for supplements to avoid being classified as new drugs. And that was a critically important step for all who believe in dietary supplements as an alternative for their health and well-being, rather than being required to take drugs in all cases for those. So that's sort of my background as I came into this. We good? That's right, no one's paying attention here. So. All right, testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Not getting anything?
good lesson for law students particularly is if you use technology in your presentation, assume it will break. And particularly the corollary of that is assume it will break at the worst time, not the best time. So, but
And grab more pizza.
Right,
It's the
exactly.
perfect time to do that. So can I grab Jeff's mic while you're doing that, and we can proceed, and you can mess with replacing that?
Yeah, good.
All right, let's do that.
I can just talk into your tie afterwards.
There you go. There you go.
I'm usually loud enough that people are saying, get the mic away.
So my current position with the American Kratom Association is that I am the Senior Fellow on Public Policy, which means that I do government relations, which means that I do lobbying. When my mother was alive, she would always encourage me not to use the term lobbying when I described myself. She thought it might be more respectable to call myself a piano player at a bordello. But since I'm here with a group of future lawyers, I thought it would be okay because you were only slightly better above the curve in terms of public opinion about professions than lobbyists. So I thought we'd at least have some common ground. This issue on Kratom is an important one. If you had Googled Kratom back in 2016 after the FDA made their first attempt to schedule it under the Controlled Substances Act, you would have seen a panoply of terrible, terrible things about Kratom, because the story was then that this natural herb killed people and that it was this terribly addictive substance. So Dr. Oliver Grunman did a study of about 10,000 people who used Kratom to determine what the profile of a Kratom user was. And he found that most are married or partnered, the majority. Most are about 30 to 50 years old. Most are employed with health insurance. They most have an income of between $35,000 and $75,000 a year. And most, about just over 40%, actually consult their doctors about the use of Kratom and whether it's appropriate. Most are educated with some college or graduate studies, and some use it as an alternative pain management option for prescription drugs, either NSAIDs, which started out as prescription, now over the counter, which have a safety signal that is very high if you use them for pain management, or for opioids, which we know we're in the midst of an opioid crisis. So there is a segment of the Kratom population that uses Kratom as an alternative pain management therapy to opioids or NSAIDs. So in order, and I mentioned 2016, Dr. Gottlieb at the FDA, and the FDA tried to get Kratom banned under the Emergency Powers section of the Controlled Substances Act in 2016. And in order to do that, you essentially have to prove three things. There's what they call the 8-factor analysis. There's a little hybrid for the emergency powers where you only have to prove 3 of them. But essentially, you have to prove that the substance is deadly, that it's causing a public harm. You have to prove that the substance is dangerously addictive. It has an addiction liability that is going to spread. And then you have to prove that it is a significant public health threat. And so in order to do that, what the FDA did is first they claimed that there were deaths associated with the use of Kratom. Now that's an interesting term, associated with. It doesn't say it's caused by, but that was the impression that was left. And if you listen to the body of evidence that the FDA uses, they will always point to it. And they've increased that number from their original 33 in 2016 to their most recent submission for scheduling to the DA to say that there are 44 deaths that are associated with the use of Kratom. They also say, and Dr. Gottlieb said it clearly, and he repeats it, that it is an opioid. It is true that Kratom does hit the opioid receptors, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, but it is only a partial agonist, and that's an important term to remember. I think that Dr. Weber mentioned that it is an agonist. Well, Kratom is actually, and the alkaloids we're going to talk about, are partial agonists, and that's a significant difference. So if we look at the actual situation, the 44 deaths, every one of them is associated with either polydrug use or an adulterated Kratom product, which means that someone has spiked it with something else. The benchmark case that the FDA points to are a cluster of 9 deaths that occurred in Sweden in 2009 over a 12-month period, of which the people that died were using a kratom powder product called Krypton, which they purchased on the internet. Now, that got the attention of the FDA, as it appropriately should have. But what the FDA ignores, and there's no excuse for ignoring it, by the way, because they have an army of investigators and researchers that look at this stuff all the time. In a peer-reviewed published article in 2011, a group of scientists and researchers in Sweden looked at and determined that all 9 of those deaths were the result of an adulterated kratom product, adulterated with a toxic dose of O-desmethyltramadol. Now, if you had a cup of coffee this morning and I put in the dose of O-desmethyltramadol that was present in that kratom product, Krypton, you'd be dead right now, because that's what killed people. It wasn't kratom at all. Now, the FDA didn't look at, or at least account for, any of that, even though it's a peer-reviewed published article, and it's simply wrong for them to do so. O-desmethyltramadol is the chemical formulation used to produce a very powerful opioid called tramadol. So, in order to buttress their claim, this is a very fancy picture of, let's see, I gotta get it, there we go. This is what the FDA uses. This is what they call their phase modeling system, which shows absolutely and conclusively that the alkaloids in kratom, mitragynine and 7-hydroxymytragynine, bind to the opioid receptors in the brain. And they're right, absolutely do. You should also know that cheese binds to the opioid receptors in the brain, right? St. John's wort does, which Dr. Weber talked about. The fact that something binds to the opioid receptor in the brain, and there are many, many other things that do that are not banned, is not the issue. The issue is, what is the effect of that substance when it hits the opioid receptor, and what does it do? And I mentioned partial agonist. A partial agonist, in the case of mitragynine and 7-hydroxymytragynine, means that it never gets to your respiratory system. That's what kills people. When you take an opioid that is a full agonist, it blankets your brain, and it gives you that high, it gives you that pain relief, sedative effect, and then it kills you if you overdose on it, right? And so to look at this, and it's a critical distinction, by the way, when you look at this then, you have to ask yourself, can you overdose on kratom, and whether it's an opioid or not. So this is a, Dr. Jack Hennifield, hopefully this works, did a video. He's one of the preeminent scientists on kratom and substances, recognized by the FDA and worldwide as one of the experts, and he has joined with about 13
Thank you for
scientists.
giving me the
Like it.
opportunity to speak to this issue as it concerns scientists. 4 national surveys of more than 20,000 kratom users and more than 20,000 comments to the Drug Enforcement Administration indicate that kratom products are used by a cross-section of Americans. They are primarily ages 30 to 50, employed, and have health insurance. They use kratom for health and well-being, reporting that for them, it is either more effective, better tolerated with respect to side effects, and/or more affordable than available pharmaceuticals. For many, it is used as an alternative to opioids, whether for managing pain or addiction. The surveys indicate that they are rightly terrified of kratom bans that would leave them only with black market products or a return to opioid use, which produced more than 48,000 overdose deaths in 2017. Mortality data show that the risks of kratom are 1,000 or more times lower than the risks of opioids. The Food and Drug Administration's kratom-related conclusions are at odds with the science. Their recommended scheduling would pose a serious health threat for kratom users. In fact, since FDA developed its seriously flawed 8-factor analysis in October of 2017 and then launched its kratom advisories claiming deadly risks, narcotic-like opioid effects, and opioid analog comparisons, the kratom science has rapidly marched forward, further contradicting FDA's conclusions. New kratom science was just presented at the February International Kratom Symposium. This was convened by University of Florida researchers who are among the leaders in kratom research. They have a new $3.5 million grant from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. At the Florida conference, many of the world's leading kratom researchers provided updates on studies supporting the conclusions that kratom is not a narcotic-like opioid. Moreover, Studies of kratom's neuropharmacology are consistent with user reports of benefits, such as increased alertness, reduced pain, and as an aid to relieving withdrawal and suppression of opioid cravings. Multiple animal models show dose levels 100 times greater than people ordinarily consume do not depress respiratory depression. This is consistent with its biased G protein signaling mechanism of action. Also, in stark contrast to opioids, mitragynine did not produce abuse potential indicating rewarding effects in 2 independent animal studies, and these studies were designed consistent with FDA's guidance. These studies also show that mitragynine pretreatment reduced morphine and heroin seeking by the animals. This is consistent with self-reported use of kratom as a path away from opioids. New studies support a policy of expanded research on the promise of kratom's alkaloids as potential future breakthrough therapies for pain, addiction, and other conditions. But that is a 10-year, $2 to $3 billion per drug process that would be severely hindered by moving kratom into Schedule I with heroin. It would be unfortunate to leave Ohio's outstanding research institutions and scientists out of this burgeoning research area, just as NIH is increasing its kratom research funding. Rather than ban kratom, I encourage Ohio to pass its own kratom regulations that set standards for kratom products. Regulations could include maximum alkaloid levels that do not exceed common naturally occurring levels, as well as appropriate standards for packaging and labeling. Thank you.
So from an evidentiary standard to meet the Controlled Substances Act criteria for scheduling, first problem for the FDA is that they don't have any deaths that they can say are caused by kratom. And in fact, it's only adulterated products. And it has not been the custom and practice in the United States to ban substances that are adulterated. If that were the case, we'd have banned Tylenol. We'd ban lots of things that have been adulterated. You wouldn't have many choices left because there are amateur chemists running amok in America that are trying to adulterate lots of things. And if that's our game, then we're done because that will ban everything. We know we can't meet that standard. Second thing is does it have an addiction liability? And as Dr. Henningfield mentioned, it simply does not. There are 2 animal studies, and to be fair to the FDA, these 2 animal studies were published after they made their recommendation to the DEA. It's unfair that the FDA hasn't said give it back to us. Those 2 animal studies demonstrated that there's no addiction liability from the consumption of a kratom product, the pure kratom product, non-adulterated. Mitragynine, which is the major alkaloid in the plant, has no addiction liability according to those 2 animal studies that were done. 7-hydroxymitragynine, which occurs at a very low level in the plant, unless it's refined, concentrated, or purified, will not have any health impact on you at all if you consume a pure kratom product. If it's concentrated, it could be a problem, and so that's why we think that you limit the alkaloid content of any kratom product to that which is present in the plant. We believe that's the appropriate level of regulation. They failed in their second standard. So the third evidentiary standard they have to meet is what's the growing risk to the American public? And we know that they said that the FDA said that in 2015 there were 263 calls that were made to our poison control centers in the United States. That's not working down. You have to understand that escalated from 23 calls in 2010 up to 263 calls in 2015. So they looked at it and said, that's escalated. Now, they contributed to the problem when the FDA started talking about kratom, right? Because then people started looking at it and saying, should we use it? But remember, there are 3 million calls per year that come into the poison control centers. So if you look at 263, I can't even tell you what that number represents. I can't pronounce it enough. But it's very, very small in terms of the overall number of calls. More importantly, when you look at what the risk factors are, there were 12.4 times more babies that ingested batteries in that same time period of calls to the poison control center. Why aren't we banning batteries? There were 195.2 times more calls about alcohol than there were for kratom. And we're not going to ban alcohol, we know that. You couldn't get through law school if they did that. And then we had 381.7 times as many calls about analgesics that were ingested by people to the poison control center. No one's talking about banning NSAIDs. No one's talking about banning opioids, although we're trying to restrict them with appropriate regulations. And we think that's the appropriate thing to do. So if you look at what the landscape is in America, we saw those 7 states that ban, or 6 states that ban kratom. Absolutely true. From 2012 to 2016, when the FDA was filling the information pipeline with their disinformation about kratom, there were 6 states that jumped on the bandwagon and banned kratom. So up until 2016, they were all there: Vermont, Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. Now, one thing has happened since 2016. Tennessee found that their law was poorly crafted. The Attorney General came out and said non-enforceable, and so they have not fixed that law since the Attorney General made that decision, because of an important thing they'll tell you in a second. Now, Rhode Island did ban kratom since 2016 on the sole decision of the public health director there, who didn't have any public hearings, didn't ask for any input, didn't ask for comments from the public. She just did it. Why? And when I asked, the answer was clear: because the FDA says it's right. And Dr. Gottlieb wouldn't say anything that was wrong. What do you say to that? Dr. Gottlieb's a good guy, by the way. We should be able to trust our FDA commissioner. With kratom, you can't, because he's wrong on the science and he's wrong on the policy. So, what happened after that? There have been more than a dozen states, 15, that have advocated for bans on kratom. And we have won in every one of those states, because we've been there talking about the science, telling you the same story we're telling here. And that's the critical distinction, that when public policymakers who would have the same interest that the FDA commissioner has to protect the public, and you would think that they would jump to ban kratom, you would think the DEA would be all over this, they're standing down. Why? Because the evidentiary standard that is required in order to ban a substance in America hasn't been met. And that's why we have the success that we're having. In Utah, and this is outdated, this was last Friday, they voted in the Utah State Senate on second reading 28-1 to adopt the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which establishes labeling requirements, which says you can't sell an adulterated product, you can't put an adulterated product on the market, and it says that you have to say specifically what's in that product. 28-1. Now, if Scott Gottlieb were right, why would these legislators do that? Now, I say it was outdated because yesterday they voted 24-1 for absent, and third reading passed it out of the Senate, and it's now gone to the House of Representatives in Utah. They expect to pass this bill within the next 2 weeks, and we expect it to be signed by the governor. There are other states that are also doing this as well, that are moving forward with this. We have Kratom Consumer Protection Act that have been filed, or about to be filed: Michigan, Arizona, Oregon, Kansas, Missouri, we hope in Ohio, Wisconsin, Arkansas, Texas, Rhode Island, Georgia, Nevada. States are getting the message here that their consumers are at risk for adulterated kratom products, and what the FDA should be doing, they're not, and therefore the states ought to step in and do that. So the Kratom Consumer Protection Act is, I don't know how to get back to it. We recommend that localities restrict the purchase of kratom products to 18 and under, that no product should be offered to sale that's adulterated with any substance. The states ought to require that labeling be on the product to show its contents, no adulterants in it, limit product formulations to the alkaloid content of the plant, which means mitragynine, whatever that content is, usually about 60% of the alkaloid content, less than 2% for 7-hydroxymitragynine, which is why it has no significant health impact, because in the natural plant it's a very low level, and ban any adulterants that alter the effect of the natural plant. A Georgia Bureau of Investigation official told me at a hearing a couple of weeks ago in Georgia that he went into a store, a convenience store, bought a kratom product, asked the kid that was standing behind the counter, said, which of these products will get me high? And the clerk said, well, that one is the one that's most popular with the kratom consumer population. And so he was testifying to the Georgia legislature, that one got you high. I asked him afterwards, did you try it? He said, well, no, I wouldn't try it. I said, give it to me, I'll try it. If it's not adulterated, it won't get you high. Kratom doesn't get you high, right? So that's the bottom line. We think that there's a responsible level of regulation that can be applied by the states, and the FDA ought to be doing it too. That's what we're encouraging around the states. I'm glad to be here to share that message with you. As lawyers, you understand this evidentiary standard. Legislators understand it. We hope that the federal government will get to that point too, and I know we're going to go to questions and answers. Glad to answer anything, and thank you again for being here on this tough day, and certainly the center hosting this forum for us.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation and making a forceful case for regulation rather than prohibition being the route that the state of Ohio and the federal government ought to follow. But I want to kind of push back a little bit, both bringing Dr. Weber back in. Hopefully you can still hear us at this point, and also to have Jeff opine as well. And I'm quoting now here, as some of you may know, and all of you should, the Ohio Board of Pharmacy had proceedings moving forward with the possibility of scheduling and thereby, in a sense, prohibiting kratom in the state of Ohio. And in those proceedings, this was back in October 2018, and I'm quoting here, there were, according to the Ohio Board of Pharmacy, quote, reports of hepatotoxicity, psychosis, seizure, weight loss, insomnia, tachycardia, vomiting, poor concentration, hallucinations, and deaths associated with kratom use, stating, among other things, that in 2016 and 2017, kratom was indicated as the primary cause of death for 6 Ohioans. Now, before even pushing back on the specifics of that evidence, and again, this is for you, Dr. Weber, but also Jeff, isn't that the kind of foundation that would lead regulators, whether in Ohio or at the federal level, to say, let's start with a ban unless and until we see science that suggests that this can be used safely, and is a big part of what's going on here, a kind of instinctual reaction among regulators and legislators that if there's any evidence of harm or misuse or mismarketing or adulteration, begin with the ban and then move towards limited allowance once we know we can have a handle on this. That's my own instinct of what might be driving an eagerness by some of the states, as you mentioned, and the federal government to move in that direction. Is that how regulators think? Is that how regulators should think for a product like this?
Well, I never worked for a regulatory agency, lucky me. I would actually approach this from the other side. Unfortunately, we have a lot of evidence, certainly from the FDA, that all of the things that you just read out, when the FDA made and continues to make its claims over toxicity and deaths associated with kratom, et cetera, I mean, associated is the key word here. They didn't find what it sounds like they found. So I'm not saying that people weren't hurt. People were hurt by an adulterated product. They were hurt by other things that we should be trying to control, depending on what those things are. I don't want to see people hurt. I don't want to see people die. I can tell you, as a longtime federal person, that once you ban something, well, I would challenge you to find for me the banned product for which the rules have been eased. I don't think there is one, but I could be mistaken about that, but I don't believe there is one. So that doesn't mean you don't ban something just because, oh gee, that's hard. I mean, if it's hard, it's hard, and too bad. But my instinct based on my experience is, yeah, you stick with the science, and yes, you want to be conservative, but what we've seen are negative health effects from things other than, in this case, we're talking about kratom. And you're talking especially about the DEA. I mean, the DEA has a job. They see themselves as drug police because they are drug police. So you can like them, you can dislike them, but that's their job. When they, in concert with the FDA, put something in Schedule 1 or outright ban it, it's not coming back. There aren't examples of that. And so my personal take on that issue is to be really cautious about that, because if you have a product that turns out to be safe and hopefully very, very helpful to a large number of people, I don't want it to be difficult to be able to reinstate that. That's why I think that's one of the reasons why the DEA, after it initially put in an emergency scheduling order, Schedule 1 in 2016, the national pushback was significant. And it's the first time that, certainly in my career, that they backed off and actually rescinded that emergency scheduling order to get more information.
Dr. Weber, do you want to chime in on this front?
Yeah, I'm glad to. So, a couple of things. First, people have died from partial agonist overdoses. So, because something's a partial agonist doesn't mean that it's safe. So, I think I've seen patients die from tramadol overdoses. So, I don't think that's really a valid argument. Secondly, there was an editorial published in New England Journal of Medicine, January 2019, where the Colorado folks looked at deaths associated with kratom. They found found something interesting, which is sort of my main point here, is that when they looked at patients on autopsy and really looked at arterial blood samples, where you would see after somebody dies, what happens is all medication in their body goes from their tissues into their blood. It's called postmortem redistribution. So drug goes into the system, and the blood levels of kratom vary from 16 nanograms per ml to 4,800. So there's a very large variation in what caused potential toxicity. My point is that that demonstrates to me that the product is not regulated in terms of its consistency. And in my opinion, until we know what the right dose is, until we have a product that's consistent, adulterated product, obviously aside, the actual products are not consistent, and frankly, I think it's dangerous, and I think that as a pharmacist who protects the public health, I take a very conservative and traditional view of this, and I just think there's lots of work that needs to be done in the specific area of regulating the concentration, consistency, and also, if you look at the use pattern, what's going to happen if this drug becomes, let's say, like, if this substance becomes like marijuana, what would happen is the usage pattern would expand to outside of the 30 to 50 range, age range. So what you'll see is you'll see a greater number of adverse effects because you'll have a larger population who will also misuse the drug, or I'm sorry, the substance in a more specific way. And so I think there's a danger of, as you expand the utilization of kratom, that you're going to see more misuse. So those are just some of my thoughts about this.
No, thank you very much, and that's going to lead me to ask my last question.
Let me respond to that. I think it's important. And I respect Dr. Weber's viewpoint on this, but I would say respectfully he's wrong. And here's why. Because if we took the approach that we're going to ban something because there was a death that was associated with an adulteration, then you would not have any access to vitamins or dietary supplements today. Because Congress would have banned it. They would have allowed the FDA to do that and force them back into the new drug application process, for which there is no marketplace that would sustain a variety of consumer products that are available to you today. There were people that were dying in the 1990s from the consumption of dietary supplements that were misformulated, adulterated, and flat out bad. Now, we've cleaned that up with an appropriate level of regulation. Now, it's correct that people have died from partial agonist substances. I was responding to the claim that the FDA is making that kratom, mitragynine, has an opioid effect. It does not. It does not go to the respiratory system, which is where the vast majority, I mean, I bet almost all of opioid overdoses come from respiratory system failure. So this doesn't apply here. Now, we could have the discussion about, okay, now let's discuss partial agonists in a different context, and that's a different discussion. Finally, the New England Journal of Medicine. That article concludes, and I would encourage you to go look at it, that these various medical professionals looked at the deaths associated with kratom in Colorado and concluded that there was no basis to say that any of those deaths were caused by kratom, but rather they were caused by polydrug use in every case. Now, if that's the conclusion, then the real question is, what is the addiction liability and what is the safety factor here? The U study, which is the NIDA intramural study, concluded that mitragynine has no addiction liability at all in any consumption level that you want to take it. Now, can you overdose or can you take too much mitragynine? Probably. It gags you. It is so bad you will throw up before it hurts you, right? Now, you can take capsules, you can take powders, you still will have that same gastrointestinal effect before you get into a dangerous level. There was a study that was done by the Domingo group in Germany. By the way, it's interesting, these are two of the deaths that the FDA attributes to being part of their 44. The Domingo study headline is, examining 2 deaths with mitragynine. What they attempted to do is take the highest level of mitragynine in the bloodstream of a decedent known to man at the point of the publication of that article against the lowest level to see if there was any causation relationship that was response dose related to the consumption of kratom. Their conclusion was there wasn't any. That you cannot draw any causation even at the highest level known to man of that causation. That Domingo study is published peer-reviewed literature, part of the FDA's analysis. So They have to live with that. Now, the question here, bottom line question is, does kratom kill you? No.
Okay, so I'm going to thank you, and Max, among other things, a great example of to be an effective lobbyist, you need to know your stuff, and he clearly does, and able to cite it effectively. My question to you, and maybe is a pointed question to a representative for the American Kratom Association, but it's part to the entire panel, and it'll be my last question, then I'll open it up for Q&A from the audience, is what's really going on here a concern about the commercial industry? That at the end of the day, and your anecdote about the Georgia legislature going to the gas station and purchasing this product, the fact that I can drive up and down High Street, there's a new storefront, Life of Kratom, that opened up, I noticed, up the street, down the street, there's a long-standing smoke shop at the corner of King and High that now has kratom plastered, across its window. And the concern, whether it's a justified concern by the FDA, by the Board of Pharmacy, by others, that even if this isn't a dangerous product on its own, it's inevitable that the marketing universe that surrounds it is going to aggravate its dangers because it's an unknown subject. The desire to adulterate it, to provide that high, whether for good reason or bad, that the desire to expand the population of people who will be interested in using this, including young people and others who will be regular consumers and have the disposable income to spend on something just for the effect. Those are all the risks that a new drug like this necessarily creates, and without seeing the obvious benefits that come from allowing use. Now, it's again where the science needs to get to. Maybe there are extraordinary benefits. Dr. Henningfield clearly thinks there are, but that, again, the instinct isn't the drug itself is so bad, but what we might unleash in the marketing, consumer, commercialization, right? We hear the exact same arguments with respect to marijuana. We hear, I think not inappropriately, a concern about that's how we got into the opiate crisis, right? That it was, over commercialization of this product by big pharma that led to overprescribing and the like. And so could part of the story be, especially right now, a kind of hypersensitivity of the market providing this substance to people in a way that the FDA is so anxious about? Their instinct is ban first, find healthy uses later, rather than the other way around.
Well, I think as Jeff appropriately pointed out, when you ban something, getting it back on the market is unlikely, if not impossible. First, kratom is not a drug. It's a dietary ingredient that can be formulated into a dietary supplement product under appropriate regulations, and that's the key to this. The key to it is appropriate regulation. So you restrict a manufacturer from producing any kratom product, and this, by the way, is America, where we have freedom to make choices, right? You don't ban stuff because we don't like it or because we are fearful of something. We make people prove their case, and the FDA has not proved their case to ban. So you put appropriate regulations on. You cannot adulterate the product. You can't put something in it that has a deleterious effect that's going to harm people. That's appropriate regulation. The pure plant, the plant itself in its natural form, you don't allow people to boost the alkaloid levels in order to get some kind of a high. That's appropriate, nothing wrong with that. Put a label on it so people know exactly what they're getting. It goes to the dose argument that Dr. Weber made. Let them know exactly what's in the package, and then they can decide. Not only did I go buy some kratom stores on the way here, I went to buy McDonald's. I can overdose on Big Macs. I can kill myself on Big Macs, but I've not heard one person say we're going to ban them, right? Now, we know what the effects are. We know the cost to the healthcare system of overindulgence in a number of products. Alcohol is another example. Why don't we ban alcohol if that's what we're trying to do? It kills people. It kills them not only for their health problems, but it kills people out on the roads. Why don't we ban alcohol? Because we live in America. Because we let consumers make safe choices, and we regulate the alcohol industry. We regulate kratom. That's what we should do. That's the appropriate level recommendation.
Other thoughts on this topic before I open up to the panel, to the audience?
I just want to make one comment. It's more just an observation. Actually, within our addiction unit here at the medical center, our addictionologists have treated patients for kratom addiction. So it is not, you can't say that it's not addictive. So we've had, and they actually manage the same in many of the other cases. So again, I would just be cautious in some of the statements you're making.
So I would refer Dr. Weber to go to the U study, which is a NIDA intramural study, which concluded with animal studies, there is no addiction liability to kratom. Now, you can have a dependency on kratom. You can. You can have a dependency on lots of things. But what happens, Dr. Grunman looked at that very issue. You've had centuries of safe use over in Southeast Asia. It came to the United States relatively recently. That's where the Wild West started with some of the adulteration. But if you find someone that shows up at your clinic that's addicted to kratom, they're addicted to an adulterated kratom product. The profile for coming off, even long-term chronic users of kratom in Southeast Asia, when they wanted to stop using it, the addiction profile withdrawal was 3 to 5 days with a minor headache, runny nose, and maybe an upset stomach. That's caffeine withdrawal addiction. Anyone who wants to make the claim that, oh, I'm treating someone for addiction liability of kratom, needs to go talk to Dr. Yu and Dr. Hemby that did the animal studies on this and have conclusively proven that in fact there is no addiction liability to the pure plant kratom. And if you're treating someone, they've got other issues that involve the use of adulterated product. That's the bottom line.
If folks in the audience want to get into the distinction between dependence and addiction, I'd be more than happy to do so, but that is something that has the addiction community talking endlessly because it's a challenging dynamic to unpack. I want to particularly make sure we have time for any questions from the audience, from anybody interested in chiming in, uncertainty about anything we've talked about, questions going forward. This is your chance, and thank you all for coming again. I see Ollie over there.
First of all, thank you guys for being here. I think there might be two conversations here. One where we talk about how safe is kratom and is what's being said about it true, that it's causing death, etc. But the other conversation is, can it help in combating the opioid crisis? What are the actual medical benefits of kratom? There seem to be only a handful of studies. Mr. Haddow, from your experience, are there studies that are conclusively saying that kratom can help with opioid withdrawal? I know you talked about respiratory failure, and kratom doesn't seem to have the same risks when it comes to respiratory failure. I mean, how strong is that argument, or is that case for allowing kratom on the grounds that it has medical benefits?
It's a great question. So the substantial number of reports that have come in of individuals who are using kratom as an alternative to pain management therapies that have a higher safety signal. For example, NSAIDs. More people die from NSAID because of the liver toxicity and all that than ever would die
Can you
from kratom.
explain for uneducated incest?
Yeah, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug is a over-the-counter product like acetaminophen, Tylenol. There's a restriction that says you don't use this because more than so many pills a day, because it has liver toxicity that can lead to consequences, including death. Okay. The other alternative is opioids, which have their own high addiction profile and potentially deadly outcomes because of that addiction profile. So Dr. Henningfield made the point in his 8-factor analysis that he did, and by the way, he's done dozens of them for the federal government when he worked for the federal government. He mirrored the requirements in the Controlled Substances Act. His conclusion was that if you ban kratom, you will force those that are currently using it into a far less safe environment, either because they'll go to NSAIDs or opioids, or they'll go to the black market of kratom products on the internet, which is where you get O-desmethyltramadol, fentanyl, heroin, morphine, all laced into it. That's the issue for a public policymaker. Do we want to put a ban in effect, as Doug talked about, let's ban first, force those people to get, and Dr. Henningfield said it, I'm not, more people will die if you ban kratom. More people will die. Is that what public policy is about?
So let me ask a little bit of a follow-up question, though, because I think it would address what I understand Ollie to be asking about. Is your association or the members of your association actively interested in the scientific studies and ultimately becoming a product that would actually be prescribed or made available by physicians or others when they encounter somebody with an opiate addiction? I put this in the context of a recent Journal of American Medical Association discussion of the debate over whether marijuana can be an effective step down or treatment for opiate addiction. As you may know, a number of states have included opiate addiction or opiate prescriptions as a qualifying condition under medical marijuana programs. And one of the points being made in this Journal of American Medical Association articles is, hey, that's dangerous because we know of existing viable, effective treatments for opiate addiction through medical-assisted treatment, a variety of other medications that have proven success over a series of well-established studies. We don't have that kind of literature for marijuana, therefore it's a bad idea, this article is saying, for states to encourage people with opiate addiction to turn to marijuana. I think Ollie was asking to some extent, is it a good idea for people with opiate addiction to turn to kratom? And the evidence, as I understand it, isn't well established. It certainly wouldn't, facilitate the FDA or encouraging doctors to prescribe it on that kind of basis. But is that the direction that the Kratom Association would like to see the law headed, or is it no, we want it available for people for a variety of settings, and we don't want the drug to get, in a sense, pigeonholed as just that kind of remedy?
So we believe in the science, and NIDA just granted $3.5 million to the University of Florida to study Kratom and its potential value in this area. We think it ought to be done. The question is, do you ban it until that study's done, right? And that's the issue. When I was at HHS, we handled the first HIV cases, the first AIDS cases. We had no idea what we were dealing with. We opened every possible barrier that existed in the federal government to allow people to use the various therapies that were being offered, because otherwise it was a death sentence. So we broke down all those barriers, and when the drug that was finally approved that was the most effective cocktail to maintain people on HIV, there were over 4,500 people who were using it at the time. Now, with Kratom, for those that find that Kratom is an effective alternative to pain management as opposed to opioids, God love them if it works for them, let them have it, because we know if it's properly regulated, you cannot kill yourself on Kratom. You can on opioids, right? So let's regulate it appropriately. No spiking it, no adulterant. Let's make sure it's the pure plant. We know that works, and that's the appropriate way to do it.
And we also need to keep pressure on all of my former bosses at NIDA. It's great to see that more money and more effort is being spent on research. That's a good thing. You can argue about what the optimal level of research would be. I don't know what the optimal level would be, especially in the midst of the politics of the current opioids crisis. To say that from the federal establishment, it's an all-hands-on-deck approach to funding research and services on opioids. If there are enough squeaky wheels, the director of NIDA will fund more research. If there are enough quality proposals from the scientific community, it will fund more research. So another aspect of this, from you guys as law students, from the research community, is to advocate for more research so that we can say exactly what you're looking for. Right now, can we absolutely say those things? For the most part, no. And that has to be our goal, frankly, regardless of the substance we're talking about.
If we have time for at least one more question before I give the panelists the last word. Sir?
I own Kratom. My name's Jack Smith. For the last year and a half, what I'm seeing you guys talk about, like the age of 50, 40% of my business is 60 and over. And it amazes me, and just to hear the stories, when they come to me and tell me the benefits and what it's done or how they've gotten off pharmaceutical drugs. Are we fighting pharmaceutical to truly, or pharmaceutical worry about taking that much money from them, because when you talk about the opiates and stuff. But that is amazing, is how many elderly people are coming to me.
And can I ask you, where are they getting their information? Do you know?
They've
Is
gotten
it word of mouth?
from the internet.
Mhm.
That's where I'm, they're telling me. So, and I'm not a physician by any means, so I can't sit here and tell you. When I first got into business, I was a professional race car driver for NASCAR, and I broke my neck and I got hooked on pain meds for 3 years. In 2007, 2010. I didn't find Kratom about 3.5 years ago. It literally changed my life, but I didn't want to go from one addiction to another addiction, so I went to Indonesia. I spent a lot of time, looking into this, and because I didn't want to open a business either. And next thing you know, I have thousands of customers who are all addicted to something. So I see how much it helps the opiate world, but it really amazes me how much it's helping elderly people.
And I can speak to that as an elderly person. You end up with aches and pains that you would rather take something natural, if you can, if it's safe, to deal with those aches and pains rather than something that might impair your ability to move around and get that kind of thing. So, hey, this is America, and we believe in freedom for consumers, and there should be very tight regulations about restricting or banning any product, and that's what the Controlled Substances Act does. And if Dr. Gottlieb were right, the DEA has had his recommendation since October of 2017. We're now a year and a half later, and nothing from the DEA. When they first submitted in 2016, as Jeff pointed out, within 3 months in an unprecedented action, the DEA sent it back to the FDA and said, no thanks. First time in 82 tries they've done that under the Emergency Powers Act, proportions of the Controlled Substances Act. We want consumers to be protected as much as anybody, but we want responsible regulation, not this, let's go ban and then try to sort it out.
So at the risk of getting wonky about the Controlled Substances Act and the work of the FDA, I understand completely why there's strong opposition to having it be on Schedule 1, but what about placement on Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5, right? The point of the Controlled Substances Act was to create a science-based mechanism for treating a lot of drugs a lot differently. And this again relates interestingly to marijuana, where for a while at the federal level the debate was, can we get it off of Schedule 1 onto another schedule? Now there's a big push to just have it descheduled, treated like alcohol and tobacco. Right now it's unscheduled, right? And so, is there any level of scheduling that you'd be comfortable with? Or, this gets back to my question back to Jeff, no, we think it's a good thing to let the states, kind of work their way through this however they do, and the Fed should just stay the heck out.
So this is going to shock you. Congress made a mistake with the Controlled Substances Act. Because the only way you can schedule kratom right now is as Schedule 1, because it has no approved medical use. It's a dietary ingredient. It is not a drug. And because of that, that's the only option available, and so the other schedules aren't available. If we were to get to a point where there's a medical use determined by some product that's supplied for under the new drug application, then it could be scheduled lower. But right now, the only option is to ban it entirely under Schedule 1, and that's unacceptable.
Dr. Weber, you have any?
Bob, I have to go to another meeting. It's been a really great conversation. I appreciate being involved in this.
Well, thank you very much for being able to be available. You with the other committee. We appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Want to speak to, the CSA and scheduling and
Well,
challenge?
let me piggyback on what Mac just said. The Schedule 1 argument is more of a political argument today than it is a scientific argument, because there are only two things that you have to really show to put something into Schedule 1. Is there some abuse liability? And is there an FDA-approved use? If the answer to the FDA-approved use is no, that's a definitional, not scientific question. Is there some abuse liability? Well, there's abuse liability for all kinds of things, and so if the answer is either yes or, well, yeah, kind of. By definition, you're going straight to Schedule 1, and these were arguments that I had the pleasure of being part of when I was at NIDA, when part of the federal system in helping the DEA schedule or not schedule certain drugs, they have to do mostly what the FDA recommends, and the FDA doesn't make a recommendation without NIDA's input. And I was in the room when the director of NIDA was sitting at the head of the table, and the scientific program staff were sitting on one side of the table, and the science policy staff and myself were sitting on the other side of the table, and we were beating the crap out of each other, frankly, talking about both the science and the public health implications and public health policy around this. And for me, as a public health person and as a science policy person, what I'm particularly concerned about, regardless of what you think of any of the other details around this that we talked about today or that you may have read about, if you make this product impossible for a very large number of people who are currently using it, whether you like the fact that they're using it or not, they're using it for pain relief, and something about it is working for them. If you pull that away from them, they are going to be desperate. You would be desperate. What would you do? You would either go back to the opioids you were using before, oxy or something like that. You would already be drug naive, and they would affect you more severely. Or you go on the street and you buy heroin. And what's going to happen? You are going to overdose. Not because you're a stupid person, but because your body is now much more drug naive than you used to be. And you're going to see a huge spike in overdose deaths. And first and foremost, I would like to prevent that. Once I keep people alive, then I can get to all these other things. But what I don't want to see, we already have nearly 200 people per day dying of drug overdose in this country. We don't need to do anything that we're pretty sure is going to increase that number. So as a mainstream, addiction and public health expert, that's actually where I start. Then I get down into the scientific weeds of the agency that I worked for and hopefully that was it. And I lost that argument with my boss. She, the scientific program staff won that argument, and I did concur with the FDA's recommendation to the DEA because it's a definitional issue, not a scientific issue. That was over a year ago, and lots of us are still trying to talk to all of our friends on the inside of the bureaucracy, trying to figure out what, if anything, the DEA is going to do. And quite understandably, nobody would talk to us. And if I were in their chair on this particular topic, I wouldn't talk to me either. Because I think right now, I mean, that what they've decided is we're just going to sit tight for the time being and see what we can do. That's the only conclusion I can come.
I got Beth to wrap us up. So we're time.
This is not really important. But it shows we've gone down the rabbit hole. When we're talking about using marijuana as simple one drug to replace OxyContin, fentanyl, number 2 drugs, what's wrong with that picture in terms of government regulation and control? It's ridiculous. And we can probably spend hundreds of millions of dollars in studies over the next 10 years. And we might not come up with anything more logical in terms of the Controlled Substance Act. I'm not hopeful.
Well, and I am hopeful that you all will join me in thanking our panelists, and I want to make sure there's time for follow-up individually if people want to. Thank you all for, again, coming out on a cold day. I'm also, hopeful, and I'll use Beth's comment as a useful promotion of our own effort at the Drug Enforcement and Policy Center to not just study this issue, but the range of issues that it necessarily connects to. We're thinking about trying to do an event in 2020, which will act next year, which will be the 50th anniversary of the Controlled Substances Act, because there's good and bad to be found therein and in the work the government does, and that's a big part of what our center, based here in the law school, is really all about. We're not scientists doing the medical research, but we're in a position to try to figure out whether or not governments are responding to that research effectively, and we're, again, grateful to folks getting here today to share their perspectives on these important issues. So thank you so much. Thank you all again for coming by, and please follow up.
Thank you.